I'd like to invite our next speaker up, Chris Gainham from the City of Hamilton. Is Chris here? There he is. In his current role as Senior Project Manager of Water and Wastewater Planning at Hamilton Water, Chris leads a group responsible for master and operational planning, wet weather management, monitoring, modeling, and developing solutions to urban flooding. Prior to joining the city in 2006, he worked in consulting as an urban hydrologist and in academia in wetlands and cold regions research. Chris's bachelor degree in physical geography and earth science from the University of Waterloo was followed by master's work in watershed planning and postgraduate studies in environmental engineering. Welcome, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, Dan, for the invite. It's my first basement flooding symposium, but we've been working together on various measures over the years. I'm well aware that it's half an hour before lunch, so I'll stick to the script. Just going to talk about new development, high infiltration inflow, and a 1,000-year event. I don't know if anybody's heard of a 1,000-year event lately, but we had one last year. Just give you a bit of an overview to the presentation, give you some background to the City of Hamilton, some of the programs we have in place, our approach to I&I, the 1,000-year storm that happened last year, our approach to flooding forensics, a bit of sewer detective work, and some of the remedial and adaptive measures that we've implemented. So City of Hamilton, the purple area is the area of the city serviced by combined sewers. The green and black is the outlying sanitary serviced area. It's about a 40-60 split. All the red dots show where we've had flow monitors in place for I&I assessment. You'll notice we haven't had a lot for I&I in the combined area because I&I refers to stormwater entering sanitary sewers in the outlying areas. Binbrook, which you'll see to the south, to the bottom of the slide there, is the subject of this presentation. It's a relatively new and growing community in Hamilton. It's very much on the outskirts of the city. Current population is around 6,000. It's expected to grow to about 14,000, 15,000 people in the next 10 or so years. Hamilton has over 500,000 people, primarily serviced through one large combined treatment plant. It's the red square down there. 3 major interceptor sewers, lots of combined, lots of sanitary, lots of storm sewers. Just because of the topography of the city, we're a 2-level city where we have a escarpment bisecting the city. We've got 70 pump stations in the sanitary network. Just given the age of the city, we've had sewers in place for about 150 years, so we've got many diversion structures within the city that hydraulically manage flows under different flow conditions. We have a real-time control system similar to Ottawa, which we use in the combined system to hydraulically manage flows as well, primarily for CSO control, but some of the RTC sites are also have a dual function where they hydraulically separate out a neighborhood from high surcharge in local sewers and prevent flooding. 23 CSOs, and we've added 320,000 cubic meters of CSO storage in the city to meet our pollution control targets. So what is I&I? I thought that we'd have a varied audience today, a lot of insurers, seems like we have a lot of municipal engineering types as well. As Dan and the other presenters mentioned earlier, I&I generally refers to the unintended flow of rainwater, stormwater, groundwater entering a sanitary sewer system. So you size the combined sewer system to take storm flows. You size the sanitary system to take sanitary flows and not storm. When you do get storm flows in a sanitary system, you run into problems. Typical problems, you're spending money on more treatment, conveyance. You get, in big events, You get bug washout at your treatment plant, so you get a reduced level of treatment that can go on for many days after a storm. In the worst cases, you get sanitary sewer overflows, surcharge, and basement flooding. Typically break down I&I sources into direct and indirect sources, so things that are directly connected to the sanitary sewer, and indirect sources, which are typically groundwater sources. We split that out further to private property sources and sources within the public way. Private property sources, downspouts, foundation area drains, unkept cleanouts, and broken or cracked or aging laterals. Public right-of-way, we still end up with some problems within the public right-of-way where you might have a catch basin either leaky or illegally connected. You might have manhole lids that are open grid on the sanitary system where they should be closed. And then you can have pure cross connections to the storm system, and as well as a bunch of defects within the sanitary system that can cause flows to get in. Mimicking what Dan showed earlier on, just some of the possible routes of storm and groundwater flow into the sanitary system. So I&I, this is a snapshot of flow monitoring, the flow monitoring data that you might get when you put a monitor in the sanitary system. So there's a few different components of flow that we look at. That base infiltration, which is the green bar at the bottom, is kind of the unavoidable groundwater that will get into a sanitary sewer no matter what. So that's designed for and expected. The wastewater flow typically has a dual peaked signature. You know, you have a morning peak and an evening peak. And that blue is I&I, and in this case it's a pretty rapid I&I in the system, which can, I mean, we've seen I&I rates that are 20 times dry weather flow, so a huge peak in response to a storm. And often after the storm, you still have an elevated flow in the system, which is that blue right at the tail end. So. City of Hamilton's approach to I&I, we've had a pretty active I&I program for the last 30 years. We have design allowances, which are typically in tune with other municipalities in Ontario, 0.2 to 0.4 liters per second per hectare, depending on the level of service that you get from your storm sewers. Since around 2004, we've put 200 plus flow monitors in the system, and we maintain a network of 30 rain gauges. Where we do have big events, and we have had a lot of big events in the last 10 or so years, we'll often go back, and as part of our forensic analysis of that storm, we'll do a gauge-adjusted radar analysis of the storm to get a better idea of the severity of the event in different areas of the city. You know, we do what every other municipality does as well. We do smoke testing, wet weather inspections, CCTV, Zoom, and dye testing. We've CCTV'd or Zoom camera'd our entire system every 5 years, and now we've done it a few times. One of the big pushes for an aggressive II program in the last 8 years, we've had 18 storms severe enough to cause major flooding in the city. So these are typically 50 to 100-year storm events. July 22nd, 2012, we had a very large and slow-moving storm go through the city. Luckily, it was south of the urban area, but it did manage to hit Binbrook. So what you see here is the 12-hour precipitation totals from that storm. And in that dark purple area in the middle, which thank God is relatively uninhabited, the 12-hour precipitation totals were 200 to 250 millimeters of rain. Now for this storm, the majority of the rain fell in about a 2.5 to 3 hour period. So that 12 hours is not completely telling of what happened. And Binbrook was the one area of the city that got hit quite hard. So there's a snapshot of the Binbrook urban area. It's a pretty small area. again serviced by a separated sanitary and storm system. Now, as part of our kind of proactive approach to II, we've been flow monitoring in Binbrook and other new developments over the past few years. We have 5 flow monitors in Binbrook, and we had 5 flow monitors in Binbrook when this storm hit, which really gave us a good snapshot of what happens when you get a major event on a newish development. So like I said, full build out, around 14,000 people. Right now we have around 6 or 7. Most of the area is built within the last 10 to 12 years. It's vulnerable from a servicing standpoint because it's serviced entirely by a single pump station and a very long force main. So it's about 10 kilometers outside of the city, and we have a 10-kilometer force main draining the Binbrook area. We've been proactive with flow monitoring and II assessment in the area because we've been tracking it for about 4 years and seen that there's quite a response to storm events. But again, nothing compares to what we saw in this 1,000-year plus storm. So like I said, we've been tracking it for a while. Typical flows, dry weather flows in the area were about 40 liters a second. During large events, we'd add II on that and see a response around 140, 120 liters a second. So that was approaching the capacity of the pumping station downstream, and we, previous to the big storm hitting, we were looking at trying to fast track some of our infrastructure upgrades that were identified through a master planning process in 2006. So, the big storm. We had hundreds of flooding calls. Initially, we only had about 60 flooding calls for this area. I just looked at the Hansen database, which is what we use to code and track all the flooding calls that come into the city. And we had something like 375 phone calls into the city. It could be months after we were just reporting that they had flooding. One thing that I think has helped us to identify areas at risk of flooding is a really good outreach program. We tell people we can't properly do forensics on storms and flooding unless we know you've been flooded. So I think people are getting the message, and they're actually phoning the city when they're getting flooded. So they phone their insurance company, and they also phone the city. So this is snapshots that I grabbed. There was actually a Facebook page created the day of the storm by some of the residents in Binbrook, which is actually quite helpful, actually looking at the photos of the event and just seeing the extent of surface flooding. This storm tracked across Ontario from Hamilton to Ottawa, and the last time I looked, the IBC pegged insured losses at around $80 million. The post-event assessment, we've been through this enough times. We have a pretty good protocol and flooding triage in place to investigate the causes and potential remedial measures to prevent flooding. So our rain gauges, which weren't unfortunately in Binbrook, they were about 5 kilometers away, but they suggested anywhere from 140 to 250 mils of rain in about 3 hours. We had an independent assessment of that storm and pegged the return period of the storm beyond 1,000 years. Like I said earlier, we had those 5 flow monitors in place, and they give a really good snapshot of what happened in the sanitary system. And I'll show some snapshots of that in a later slide. But generally, I completely overwhelmed the system. In the lower reaches by the pump station, we had 8 liters of surcharge. Peak flows of 530 liters a second, which is equates to 10 times our I design rate. We also went around and did interviews with residents. And based on that information, we came up with a rough split of a 40-60 split 60% of the basement flooding calls were typically due to stormwater or clear water entering somebody's house either through sump pumps or foundation. They had foundation issues. And the remaining 40 was attributed to sanitary sewer backup. Oh, sorry, I switched that around. 60 was sanitary sewer, 40 was sump pump and clear water. So our typical flooding triage response, probably typical of a lot of cities, where we have the information available, we typically look at rainfall and sanitary flow monitoring, smoke testing, and wet weather manhole inspections. Now, the wet weather manhole inspections is something relatively new that we've been doing. Like I said, we have CCTV and Zoom camera data for the entire city. Typically, that's done in dry weather. You can only see so much in dry weather, and those CCTV and Zoom investigations are tailored to identify major structural issues in the system, not wet weather, not I&I. So there's typically a limited amount of information you can get from them. The interviews with the residents, I think, were very very helpful and backed up a lot of the flow monitoring data that we saw. We are still in the process of doing an engineering review of the major and minor storm system and looking at possible storm and sanitary interactions. And like I mentioned earlier, we are revisiting our master planned upgrades for that pump station. So how big should you make that pump station, and how can you properly manage big flows? So like I said earlier, we measured 140 mils near Binbrook during that storm, potentially much more, and well beyond a 100-year event, getting into the beyond 1,000-year event return period. So here's a snapshot of the level data that you get from a flow monitor. Now, a typical flow monitor will give you level, velocity, and a calculated flow. You can use all those, all that information to help do some sewer detective work and see what's actually going on in the system. I mean, the level data just correlates quite well with where we had issues in the city or in the Binbrook area. That high peak, the highest peak in the flow monitoring data is reflective of the surcharge in the bottom end of the system where we had lots of basement flooding. The smaller peaks were up in the upper parts of the system where stormwater inflow to foundations was more of a cause. And the flows to the station, a bit of an interesting flow response. You can see the flow response of all the individual monitors up at the top of the slide, and that pink peak is the cumulative flow from all the flow monitors. But you'll look at the bottom, there's actually a negative scale on this. The system hydraulics were so violent during this event, we actually had negative velocities and negative flows. So a whole section of the system actually backed up to the tune of about 300 liters a second up one side of the catchment. So it looks like one catchment was actually overwhelmed by flows coming from another side of the catchment. Just sheer hydraulic violence, really. Another thing that we do when we're looking at severe events is analyze scattergraphs from the flow monitor. You can tell quite a bit about the hydraulics of the system by looking at the velocity response with different depths. And this typically is used in a post-event flooding assessment. So all these little boxes represent levels and velocities monitored during the storm event. The four flow monitoring snapshots without the arrows represent a typical response. So the system starts to surcharge, but you still have a positive velocity. You're still draining out. That one flow monitor near the bottom and flow monitoring the catchment that had the majority of sanitary sewage backup showed huge negative velocity. So about 10 or 12 feet a second of negative velocities backing up that catchment. The smoke testing and reconnaissance, everybody wants you to find the smoking gun when you do smoke testing. They want you to find a pond or a storm sewer directly connected to the sanitary sewer. You can pat yourself on the back after and say you've solved the problem. Typically not the case. It can be I&I and cross connections can be pretty elusive. So our smoke testing did not find any severe direct connections. What the recon and the smoke testing did find is a bunch of minor issues that can add up and cause you problems. We only found one open grid lid on a sanitary sewer, which was quickly swapped out. It didn't actually service a large catchment area, so we didn't think that would be a big issue. It is a new development, so catch basins sometimes are covered up with a geotextile fabric, and in that case, that catch basin's not working. It's keeping water in the road. Now, when you have water in the road and you have manholes with a couple of pick holes, that's a source of I&I, and I'll go on. I'll explain how big that issue can be. We also had one case of an unfinished manhole with that curb inlet, which could be a significant source of flow of the water was ponding. But again, looking back at the catchment area that actually drains to that, not a big issue. So we were left kind of scratching our heads. Here's another example of a potential source of rapid flow that might be overlooked in a lot of cases. This is at the top of a manhole, and these are the risers up at the top of the manhole. So you bring the manhole up to the level of the road. In a new development, the final road base isn't on, and you'll often have an unfinished manhole that looks like this. Now, during an event, the manhole on the right can actually look like, or the manhole on the left can look like the manhole on the right, be a significant source of flow. Once the development is done and that final road base is on, they bring up the manholes, they seal them off with concrete, and they're no longer a source. But in the interim, it can be an issue. Like I said earlier, the wet weather inspections of the system were really critical. We have great CCTV on the pipes. We have a pipe system that's PVC in this area. You wouldn't typically find a big source of infiltration within the pipe. So we were focusing on the manholes, and we actually had Larry from TQI and his team go out and do a wet weather manhole inspection. And what we found was interesting and a little troubling to say the least, but again, nothing that you can't plug with a proactive grouting program. So we found about 25 sources of inflow, typically what you'd see here at junction points, where we have joints within the manhole or pipe system. Like I said earlier, we just finished redoing the CCTV in the area and found a few minor issues. But again, in this case, it looks like it was more of a flooding by 1,000 drips. Lots of small sources, no one big smoking gun, so a little more difficult to track down. You have to be quite diligent and doggedly determined to track this down. One thing that we did look at, this area has about 200 manholes. Each one has 2 pick holes. We knew with all the flooding in the roadway that this was probably a major source of flow into the sanitary sewer system. Coal Engineering, which is a local engineering company, has actually come up with a field methodology to measure the amount of flow that can come into to a typical manhole. So this is showing the flow under ponding in a typical manhole with 2 pick holes, and the green line represents that. So you can get over 2 liters a second through those pick holes per manhole. So you multiply that by 200 manholes and you quickly have an issue. Just just a little snapshot of their proprietary measurement device, and the field setup that they use to actually test this. So one of the no-brainers for us was, well, why don't we just go in and switch out all the two-pick manholes for solid manholes? It's probably a quick win, it's a no-brainer, it's easy to do, and you could possibly reduce flows in your system during major events. So yeah, we were used to 100-year storms, we had a lot of them. But a 1,000-year storm is pretty impressive, and it's a good snapshot of the total maximum potential II that you can get into the system. We're going to expect to have the major system, which is the roadway, flooded more often and more frequently, and cause problems like this. The pick holes, it was a quick and easy way to reduce the potential for inflow to the system. One thing that we've been doing for the past few years is flow monitoring new developments. You can't just leave it up to the developer to build a tight system. We've got to keep track of it. For the past couple of years, we've required mainline backwater valves in all new constructed homes. And so again, the simple, cheap, and reliable solutions are often the best. Engineers and water resource planners can come up with all these great solutions, but at the end of the day, it's often the collection system guys out in the field that are maintaining what you've told them to put in. The simpler, the better sometimes. The wet weather recon has been a really critical item in identifying defects across the city. And I think we got a really good understanding of the vulnerabilities of new infrastructure to wet weather issues and to severe wet weather. Another thing that we are doing, there's an upcoming citywide flooding and drainage master plan looking at opportunities to solve issues citywide. So far, we've taken large areas of the city that we have already identified as being susceptible to flooding and done individual flooding studies. But given the resources that we have now, we have an all-pipes hydraulic model that's fully calibrated. We have a very good understanding of our system. It's prime time to pull that all together into a master plan and come up with a long-term plan to address flooding and II and drainage issues across the city. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. I'd like to invite any questions for Chris. Derek? Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, Jeremy Blair, City of Mississauga. Chris, if I understood your presentation correctly, in Binbrook, where we had found that there was significant infiltration into the infrastructure management its group. So these will be fairly new systems, correct?
Yeah, less than 10 years.
So this is quite disturbing to me. Are there any lessons learned in terms of construction practices for new systems? Are there any deficiencies in how these systems are being constructed nowadays that looked out there?
I'm going to repeat that for the recording. If there's any lessons learned on new construction since Binbrook was a new development.
Sure. Well, I only presented the I&I related investigations that we're doing. We're also doing peer reviews of the major and storm system drainage in that area. Sure, I mean, just making sure that you have adequate major system conveyance and you're not keeping ponded water in the road for an extended period of time, I think is an important double check. We're investigating new standards for sump pumps and sump pump drainage to surface. I mean, with a large amount of the issues caused by clear water, stormwater getting into foundations for cracks and whatnot. We are revisiting our loft level drainage specs. So, yeah.
I understand all that, I just mean the manholes, they had some pictures of brand new manholes.
Yeah.
Water coming in all
That actually wasn't from Binbrook.
Oh, okay.
No, that was it's just showing what could happen. Yeah. So we have investigated pretext seals and whatnot for new developments, so that may be something that we pursue down the road.
Yes, at the back.
I came from Two Brothers Construction. I was asking about infiltration around the manholes. You guys find that there's more water now on the roads that are causing this infiltration around the manhole rather than in the manholes? Because I realize that's a problem too.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, I gave one example in Binbrook. Other areas in the city, we've identified that as more of a problem, so we're investigating coming up with a manhole rehab program, either using a Cretex type seal or a spray-on seal. And we do actually have a manhole readjustment program in place now, which completely rebuilds the upper part of the manhole. So.
Just traditionally, like you go around and just jackhammer?
I'd have to touch base with the guy that's in charge of that, but essentially they core out the top of it, remove the entire top section and rebuild it, pour it up, so there's no opportunity for infiltration. Sure.
And Victor, City of Ottawa, I noticed at the beginning of your presentation, you're using a figure of 0.4 liters per second per hectare,
Yeah.
which is well known. I find that interesting because we did a statistical analysis of all flow monitoring data
Yeah.
since 1967 and found that the 0.2 weight that's widely used in the province, well, if you add a return frequency to it, really 100 year would be double that. So how did you come up with your 0.4?
Well, I didn't come up with it. A lot of the issue is just established engineering convention. I think you can talk to most of the engineers in the city, and they wouldn't actually know where the 0.2 or 0.4 comes from. They might pick an MOE guideline from the 70s or something. But
It's nice to know that it's being boosted up.
yeah, yeah. But again, that 0.2 and 0.4 shouldn't be applied to storm event response. There really shouldn't be any response to storms within the sanitary system. If you have groundwater inflow at 0.2 liters a second, that's manageable. You know what you're getting, but you don't plan for these peaks.
Yes, please.
Christine Hill from XCG Consultants. Chris, I agree with you that the manhole pig holes can be a major source of infiltration and inflow, particularly when they're playing on the road. But what I found in certain municipalities, there's some pushback on actually putting a hard lid on that, and that's related to the pigs actually have a function. That's
Yeah.
inflow. So have you found that?
We have, and we've there's been a little bit of wrangling with our collection systems maintenance group. For now, we're moving ahead with it. Our thoughts were that, I mean, you still vent the system through the roof stacks. You're still venting the system through homes. So what we've done, we've installed the solid manhole covers, but we're also doing odor H2S monitoring within the system to see if we get H2S spikes and end up with corrosion and odor issues. So it's a wait and see.
Thank you for your questions, and I'd like to thank Chris for his presentation.